Hi, so part two of the Pacific folding bar is done. It's turned out absolutely excellent, and considering this was recycled timber, so all the colours have come up really nicely, especially with all the different tones. So if you want to see how it was made, and especially you want to see the final part of the build where we finally put it together, stick around and let's go. So we are completing the second part of the Pacific folding bar build. In the last episode, we glued together a lot of the panels and the main box itself. In this episode, we're going to work on the smaller boxes. These will be on both sides, and then also the tabletops that will flip over on top. So to start off with, I'm just removing the larger pieces of the gap filler that I used. I talked about this in the previous part, but essentially it's a hot glue-like substance that will fill the majority of the little holes. And given this is recycled timber, it did take a while for me to go along and fill the majority of the nail holes. I'll mark out where I'm going to need to put internal dividers, and this will form one of the two side boxes. So as I go along and mark out where all of the different biscuits are going to sit, and also just making sure that the shelves that are going to go on the internal of this box are adequately spaced. So I said in the last installment that the biscuit joiner was a bit of a new tool for me, and in making these small boxes, it is so much quicker, I feel, to use this biscuit joiner. And of course, if you've got something a bit higher order, like a domino, you probably use that. But having those biscuits do a lot of the aligning for me, whilst also eliminating a lot of screws and other methods, it's very, very quick and simple. The other thing you can see here is this shelf, where I've gone and used a hole saw to cut a number of holes, which then had a chamfer routed into them, and this will sit just proud of the bottom shelf of these side boxes, and you'll see they are probably best used to hold wine bottles or other bottles of nice, perhaps whiskey, in this cabinet whilst it's being rolled around. So I'll cut biscuits along the sides and then also the internals of both of these sideboards. This will then enable that lining up of the actual front panel, or the face, that you'll see when the panel is open nice and wide. Finally, we'll remove that horizontal plate, and this gives us the ability to then drop biscuits into the center of the board. These are much harder to line up, and I tend to use a couple of methods. The first one is, you can see 3 red lines on the base of the biscuit joiner. So where possible, try and line one of those lines up with the edge of your material, and then also the horizontal lines that I've marked out are also a reference. I'll go and throw the biscuits now in there and prepare for the glue up itself. A quick test fit will prove whether or not any of those biscuits are in the wrong place. And as you can see, another really kind of crucial thing about these biscuits is that they actually provide quite a tight fit, so much so, as you can see, I can leave them positioned in the wood. I suppose it does depend on what type of biscuits you use. If you're using super cheap ones, or perhaps ones that are made not to the same specs as the joiner you've got, they might not be this solid. However, the ones that I found from my local big box store were perfect size. And I realised after putting the entire thing together that I had put all of the centre dividers in the wrong way. So remove all the biscuits and prepare for the glue up now. So I said in the last one, I realised as of late that I probably don't have enough clamps, but if you glue these almost like a two-stage and use some interesting techniques such as ratchet straps and other clamps to do a little bit of the lighter lifting as you put it together, you can sometimes get away with smaller amounts of clamps and still achieve a relatively square glue up. And what I suppose you won't get to see is me putting the top face on one of those side boxes. Of course, I'll pump out 2 of those, and whilst they are gluing, it's time to finish sand the main box, which you saw me complete in the previous video. So I'll go along and I'll start off with 80 grit sandpaper and then slowly move up. With such a large box like this, with recycled timber and then also a lot of gap filler, there was quite a bit of sanding to go through. It's quite good to be able to have a 150mm sander, or at least in diameter sander, because it's got quite a decent surface area. Not that 125 is that much smaller, however, when trying to do such long sanding pieces, you really will enjoy having a larger surface area. What I then of course realized is that in the cracks of all of the individual shells there are small amounts of squeeze out. So in this instance I've chosen to go along with a chisel, and the chisel will slowly just chip out the pieces of smaller pieces of squeeze out. I also noticed here that there was the sander had effectively rounded over a really small component of the corner here. So just using the chisel there, applying hand pressure, I've just taken that slight round out, and that will give at least the aesthetic of a square corner. A lot of hand sanding in this project, a lot of going back and ensuring that corners didn't have tiny bits of glue and squeeze out. But realistically, if you ever manage to see this piece, you go up close, you'll notice the occasional spot where I missed something. But overall, I suppose it taught me a lesson about making sure that I really adequately clean up that squeeze out before leaving it sit, especially in tight places such as the smaller boxes. So here I use one of my smaller Ryobi palm sanders, and this is particularly because of the smaller areas that I've got to get into, the back walls of course, and just absolutely bucketing out dust because the dust collection really didn't like going around all those tight corners. Here we're using my new toy, an oscillating multi-tool. With that triangular shaped head, it was perfect for getting in all the corners and making sure that I didn't just miss out corners, as the radius of the sander you can see me using here would often leave a corner that didn't get touched as I went through different passes. So that oscillating sander gets in the corners, gets in the edges, and it was excellent for that, especially when we're starting to talk about stepping up the different grits. Those corners are definitely one of the first things that you can miss. So get your hands on one of them. So using my trim router. I've got a chamfer bit on it, and I've gone around and put a chamfer on pretty much all of the horizontal surfaces, and this is just to soften them up. So once out of the clamps, these two side boxes, they're going to get hit with the same treatment as the main box. So 80 grit sandpaper, 120 grit sandpaper, and then eventually we'll finish off at 240. So using a block plane, I realized that there was a slightly raised edge around proximate to where the front panel glues onto the box itself. So I've chosen here to just try and knock that off. And as you can see, my block plane probably needs a little bit of a sharpen. Any glue imperfections, sometimes you can just use a chisel and just be very gentle, and you can knock off those pieces of glue without needing to spend ages sanding and potentially putting divots. This is that hot glue gun fill, so just applying the hot glue, and then I apply a hammerhead just to flatten that surface off, and it needs to be left there for a while before using a blade or a scalpel to just chip that off. So another good way to make sure that you don't have glue, and you can kind of see clear as day in some of these shots, is just putting a wet rag over any surfaces that you are worried that there's still glue there. And just a wet rag means that it'll show up almost like the finish is going to show up. A bit more block plane action here to just flush the internal dividers to the box itself. So here is interesting, there's a biscuit sticking out because it was probably not deep enough and I needed to sand that top surface a little bit. So later on I'll probably just use either some of the gap filler or perhaps some stain just to take the edge off of that. But imperfections happen, and unfortunately I am not immune to that. So I hope that it doesn't stick out too badly once we're done. So using the oscillating sander and then my rotating sander, we'll hit this with 80 and then 240, or we'll build up to 240 I should say. You would have seen in an earlier shot there was a little plastic guard, and I'd taken it off because it sounded like it was rattling, and you're about to see what happens when you take that guard off. It tends to lurch around a bit, and when it contacts the sidewall just like that, it's just a safety point. A lot of the guards and so on in woodworking, steelworking tools, they're put there because the manufacturer knows that these tools have a lot of power, a lot of torque, and can throw your piece across the room without you thinking. So if you're going to take them off, be ready to have your work flung across the room. So putting that 45-degree chamfer on all of the surfaces of these boxes, and I chose a 45-degree chamfer. I was kind of going for a bit of a 20s prohibition look, which had often very kind of angular edges. Definitely kind of 45-degree angles was a big part of that look. But I suppose the other look we were going for was the Pacific side. So timber that is not matching, is a bit haphazard. Perhaps it was recovered from a shipwreck. So if you're kind of thinking what was he up to, that was what was going through my head at the time. So as I was kind of getting to this point where I've got doors, I've got the boxes that will become the doors, I realized there was a bit of a gap between them. This is very likely an error made when I changed the wood size from 80mm to 60mm floorboards, because the 80mm weren't available. So what I'll do is I'll rip down a piece of one of the last kind of boards that I had left over, and I will attempt to cover that hole with a couple of kind of flaps that will be on the inside. Won't really make too much sense until you see it, but the way I've chosen to do this is I'll rip down these pieces and then I will cut using a forceps bit a gouge in the center of them. this hole will effectively become the handle in which you open the door. So instead of the handle being a protruding handle like you would see on most kind of kitchen cabinets, it'll be a cutout in the center of the two boxes, which you can reach into and then swing it open. So as you saw, use the force and the bit to cut the top and bottom. And here, in the best filming technique you've ever seen in your life, I have put a drill in the worst spot as I use a jigsaw to cut the center line, which then will really make sure that this gouge is wide enough for you to get your hands into. So I'll biscuit it to one of the two boxes themselves, more so for just supporting it while that glue up is occurring. Aligning that rather straight piece along the front there would have been a bit of a nightmare if it wasn't for something really simple like a biscuit to keep it in place. As it came time to start to prepare these boxes to be attached to the main box, I kind of realized that they were going to be very snug, and if they were going to be snug, they were going to be potentially hitting the top and bottom, which would be very uncomfortable for anyone who's trying to open and close them because they would jam. So just using the sander here, I spent a fair bit of time just making sure that there was a sufficient gap between them and that they wouldn't pinch too much. So, speaking of hinges, I've chosen to use piano hinges because they'll provide stability the entire way along these pieces of timber. Given that we've got a relatively small surface area that the hinge is attaching to, the piano hinge will also be quite good at dispersing the weight of these boxes. The one problem I had though is that I couldn't get a hinge in the interval that I needed, so we'll cut those down to, I think they were 900mm hinges, and I needed them cut down to like 850mm. So using the angle grinder here, I'll just slowly chip away at them. Being a relatively thin metal, it wasn't so much a hard cut, but rather the steel just wanted to jump about. Despite them looking like brass, they are brass plated steel brackets. So now to finally hang these boxes themselves. So I'll start out by effectively aligning the hinge on the inside, but you can see there I've propped up the boxes, or in this case the right hand side box, to just make sure that when I am positioning this, I'm positioning it very central to both boxes, because if you go too far on the inside, the box won't be able to open fully out and then flush itself, which for this case will mean that you won't be able to close it properly. So I did the top and bottom screws, and then went along, drilled pilot holes, and then put brass screws in the remaining holes. So here I'm using a self-centering drill bit, and used with a slightly longer pre-drill bit, I was able to get a really nice fit for all of the screws, but at the same time, I'm very lucky I didn't have any chip or kind of tear out as a result of the really narrow surface area that I've got to put this hinge in. So if you're doing something similar, of course, really make sure that you've got the right size screw for the job. One of the other things I did when I set these up is, you might be able to see I've used shims, whether it was a small piece of folded over sandpaper, some cardboard, or a small offcut. And this is just to make sure that both sides were slightly elevated off of the bed that they were being attached to. Unfortunately, however, the base, the hardwood base, isn't perfectly flat at this point in time, and it had a little bit of a rise between two boards. So when I went to close it, I found out that it was going to be a real tight fit. Not to worry, however, between sanding the base and sanding the bottom of this box, we eventually got enough of a fit that the doors will close. And here's the first time you can see that hole cut out in the center that I was discussing earlier. So for a very similar reason, on the two top pieces, which will be the extending bar itself, when I did a bit of a press fit, I realized that you'd really struggle to get your fingers underneath and to extend the bar out. So what we'll do is we will rip down a couple of these pieces of floorboard to effectively create a little handle between the two boards when they're closed. I'll use the miter saw to just chop them to length. And of course, it wouldn't be a Fairbairn Furnishings video without the obligatory flipping of the miter saw table. So one of the other things I realized was, just to keep dust, bugs and any other things out of this cabinet, I was going to just use a one-way closing door design. So think of it like your fridge, where one of the two doors is slightly longer than the other, and it forces you to close that door first and then another door second, which kind of pinches the two doors together, and it just makes for a much more solid closure. To do that, I've got a slightly wider board than the handles themselves. I'll just clamp those on with some glue, probably no need for anything else because it should be strong enough on its own. And then I'll do that top and bottom with the hole in the center remaining for you to get your hands in and open the door. But ultimately, this will prevent anything from scurrying inside with the doors closed. So the two top pieces, to this point they had been kind of sitting off to the side. I'd kind of neglected them, but this is one of those two pieces. So as you can see, I've glued up a number of horizontal pieces of timber, and they run parallel to the main top. So this means that there's quite a nice big long continuous line from one end of the bar to the other, only separated by the framing that you can see around the outside. So we'll use the technique we've done countless times. We'll start 80 grit, 120 grit, and get these nice and flat, ready for attaching. To connect these two as well, we'll use piano hinges, same as the boxes themselves. And this is that cutout design that I was talking about earlier. So you can see some kind of sketches that I've made off to the side there. I determined that For about 100 millimeters from the base, I'd create a cutout, and you could get your hand between the two and you could unfold the two top bars themselves. These circles here represent where I'm going to use a Forstner bit to cut just a nice corner out. So once that Forstner bit had cut the corner, I then used the table saw to take out some excess material. And once this was done, to get your hands underneath these pieces, I chose to use the table saw to effectively cut away a lot of the material underneath. And this then meant that you could get your hand completely underneath the piece of timber with this almost shelf kind of handle-like part, which you can see there, and you'll see more prominently as the tables flip over. And this then means you can get your fingers right underneath, just like I did there, and open the table up very simply. Of course, this table is supposed to be for nice events and so on, so you don't really want harsh edges or kind of areas where you could stick your fingers and potentially catch a splinter or something like that. So I hit it with some sandpaper for a while there. And to attach them to the main tops themselves, I've chosen to, as always, use a biscuit. Where do I come up with kind of these weird and wacky ideas, you might ask? Completely on the fly. I see problems, I see that perhaps I've made an error, and I just choose at that time to come up with a unique little solution. As I was talking to a friend of mine who was saying, where do you learn a lot of these techniques? And I basically said, no, I screw up a lot and I have to come up with unique ways to get out of it. So if you're like me, then keep screwing up, because I keep learning unique ways to get out of these situations. And as to be expected, use the chamfer bit around all of the corners of these pieces, and then we'll finish it up by just making sure that the surface between that new piece that we've glued on and the old piece is flushed up. One last hit with the sander before we get to the point where we are applying finish. At this point, as I was doing the final assembly, I noticed that there was a few little spots that probably needed a little bit more work, so now's the chance to go back and hit those. And in the background you can see the second tile, or the second bar top, being glued up. Of course, the last thing to do before hitting it with a clear coat is to apply the stamp. I've chosen to do it just on the inside, so it's not right in the center, right in everyone's face, but just tucked away next to some of these bottles. And of course, making sure that using a bit of sandpaper eventually to smooth it over and get it ready for the clear coat. So I chose to use an internal oil-based clear coat. It's just a simple varnish. Instead of using, say, wipe-on poly, which can sometimes be not as hard wearing, and also the wipe-on poly I use has a very aggressive orange tinge to it, which I really didn't want because, as you can see, there's some really nice reds coming through. So choosing to use this more clear coat, if you will, meant that some of those red colours weren't affected so much by the yellows. The other part of my finishing technique that is perhaps different to others is, instead of using a brush here, I'm using a sponge. What I do is I go and buy an automotive sponge, the one you might use to wash your car, and I just simply use a pair of scissors to cut it into small foam pieces. This first of all means that I've got quite a lot of sponge to go around, but it also means that instead of putting streaks and dropping small hairs of the brush all through this piece, the sponge often leaves a much more a fine finish, which I prefer personally. Of course, using paintbrushes, using rags, I still use these techniques often, but in this case, based on the fact that I had sanded it to a 240 grit, I knew that the sponge would be probably the way that I wanted to do it. One thing I'd say in closing is just, given the state of this wood when I first got it, it was in a horrible state. A lot of the timber was twisted, and here you can see all of that work paying off. I really felt great at this moment to see some of the colours coming through, and I knew that that rustic look that some of these bits of timber have given off will really shine through the bar itself. And here you go. So both sides swung nice wide open. I used some brass castors on the bottom so it can be wheeled out to wherever it needs to go. And then when it's done, it can be folded up, parked perhaps in a corner, ready for the next one. Finally finishing out this bar, I've really loved the experience of putting this thing together. Working with recycled timber along the way, plenty of challenges, but for it to come up looking this great, I cannot begin to describe how enjoyable this has been. The brass hinges really accent some of the really deep red tones that you can see all throughout. And then some of these lighter timber pieces, I was super worried as we were going through the process that we were going to have these really stark contrast between the different colours, but as it's come together, I think it looks really, really nice. Of course, this bar will look amazing when used in garden parties or maybe cocktail nights, or even if it's just sitting in the corner as kind of a general storage cabinet for some nice alcohol. I really want to see how this bar turns out. And it's been a lot of fun to make. So, of course, you want to see me make more things like this, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.